For many years, extremely influential and powerful individuals have promoted and had before them the vision of a new world order. It is only recently that this discussion has truly entered the public arena. I'm Julius Smetona. This is What Catholics Believe. Today we'd like to examine what this society will be like, on which we are certainly on the brink of today. With me today are the Reverend Fathers William Jenkins and Clarence Kelly. Father Jenkins is publisher of The Roman Catholic and pastor of St. Teresa of the Child Jesus Church in Parham, Ohio. Father Kelly is the superior of the Society of St. Pius V in Oyster Bay Cove, New York. Mr. William Gill is author, publisher, lecturer from Washington, D.C. He's author of Trade Wars Against America, and he is with us one more time to discuss our brave new world. Reverend Fathers, Mr. Gill, there is a remark which made a very, very strong impression on me. I believe I have the individual's name correctly. It's Rowan Gaither. I believe he was president of the Ford Foundation. It was the 1950s, and he revealed to a congressman privately that the objective, the social policy objective he was pursuing, and many like-minded individuals, was to so transform the United States economically and socially so that it could be merged with the Soviet Union and form a world superstate. Now that we've seen the effects of disastrous trade policies, now that NAFTA is a fact, now that millions of people and even hundreds of communities have been rent asunder by the dislocation in the economies, are we starting to move closer to this merger? Are we seeing this elimination of the middle class in this country, and what will it be like?
Well, you can project it, and actually I've had a little practice in this. In 1979, I was one of the few people out preaching, if you will, against the Trade Agreements Act of that year, Bob Strauss's monument, the Tokyo Round. One of the places that I was given a pulpit was at the annual meeting of the U.S. Business and Industrial Council, which was then headed by my friend Anthony Harrigan, a very thoughtful man, not the businessman who's like me, a journalist, who really a philosopher, poet. More recently by John Cregan, who came out of your John Carroll University here in Cleveland, and another very thoughtful man. We were projecting what was going to happen for the rest of this century, from the year 1980, the following year, to the rest of this century. Well, I must say that all of the things that I projected in that speech, in that talk that I gave that day, have come to pass because of the trade thing. I was focused on the trade thing and what kind of problems that it was going to cause. I did not project that the federal budget deficits would be quite as high as they are, because I did not foresee that the trade deficits would go up over $200 billion during the Reagan administration, as they did, and are still very high, as we know, well over $150 billion last year. And so therefore, I didn't anticipate what is now $5.5 trillion national debt with a $1.5 trillion international debt on top of that. Nonetheless, the social dislocation was accurately predicted. I predicted that more millions of people were going to be thrown out of work, and I was basing this on what we had experienced in industries like the steel industry that I had been working with for years as a consultant on trade, you see. And I knew that it was going to continue. I didn't realize that it was going to accelerate as fast as it did. I didn't know that the street people that we were then seeing in 1979 would multiply by now hundreds and hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people out there on the streets sleeping in the streets of America as I once saw them sleep in the streets of Calcutta, places like this, as a young man. We are becoming an Oriental nation. And my great fear has been for many years, not that we would become like the Soviet Union when it was still in its full glory, but that would become eventually like India, which is infinitely worse as far as the individual is concerned. You can't believe how bad that country is, what kind of an existence those poor people are forced to accept.
And that's a socialist government too, right?
Oh, yes. And so I would say that we have, what now? The way things are accelerating, right? And how fast they're going under this present Clinton administration, which is really a socialist administration. I mean, let's put the proper word on it. They're not Democrats. They're socialists. But they're being aided and abetted by the Republican Party, which are behaving like socialists with their support of Clinton on the NAFTA treaty, the overwhelming support that they gave him, 132 votes, Republican votes in the House, gave him that victory on NAFTA, the greatest victory he's had, as we know. And what I see coming is an acceleration of the decline that this professor that I mentioned before has charted. Began in 1972 with the first trade deficit, has continued the standard of living going down precipitously through the last 20 years, and in the next 20 years we're going to become a barefoot banana republic. Industry is going to be wiped out by this GATT treaty. There will not be any industry to speak of if it goes into full effect left in this country. The 700 steel mills that closed up in the 12-year period ending in 1987, that will, whatever steel mills are now left, and there are only perhaps 100 left, I suppose, will be gone.
There's even something else you mentioned in your book, Mr. Gill, is that you quoted a general in 1987 who said already at that time, we did not have the industry to support a war because it's been just decimated by foreign governments, not necessarily foreign companies, by foreign governments. What does this imply if hostilities would ever be to develop, which they certainly may, in our ability to maintain our sovereignty with this deindustrialization?
We could not defend ourselves. This was General Wickham, who was the Army Chief of Staff at that time, and as he was retiring, let down his hair and said that the United States could not fight a full-scale, a real war, not something like the Gulf War, which was not a full-scale war against Iraq, after all, but a real war, that we couldn't fight it for more than a few months because the industrial base is no longer there. That's a quote from General Wickham. The industrial base is gone. I mean, in comparison with what it used to be. It's been more than cut in half. Steel industry is more than cut in half.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
What will life be like in the United States for the average person, let's say, for a middle-class family man? Let's say?
Well, we now have something like 60 or 70% of all the wives in married families are working. It'll be probably something pretty close to 100% in 20 years.
Like in the Soviet Union.
Be the very few families that have, you know, the affluent group, the ersatz millionaires that have been created in more recent times, and the others who had it before. They'll be insulated, so they think, from it. But it's my belief that there'll be a revolution, because when you get to that point where, you know, you've got every family in the country suffering, see, the attitude of these people, and I just got this the other day, incidentally, from the widow of Senator Tidings, the man who did in Senator McCarthy years ago, and her attitude was, well, isn't everything all wonderful because Here we have all these new millionaires that have been created through the free trade thing, you see. Yes, we have all those new millionaires.
Employed by foreign
a few
governments.
hundred of them, or whatever it amounts to. But it overlooks the millions of other people whose lives and livelihood have been destroyed by this. It is what I call the let 'em eat cake attitude. This is the attitude of our government. Let 'em eat cake, you see. Well, we know that Marie Antoinette probably never did say that. But these people are in effect saying it.
You know, Reverend Fathers, we're witnessing a tremendous social dislocation. I think one would have to be blind not to notice that there are more people begging in the streets today than ever before. And we're also not seeing much of a commentary from the nation's bishops on this whole NAFTA situation, or the whole industrial dislocations which are destroying families. And yet, you know, this is something which affects the body and the soul. Why are we not hearing more? Why isn't this a bigger issue?
Well, if you're not hearing more, probably the reason is that the spirit of the reform is to promote internationalism. As Father Jenkins mentioned on a previous program, the very documents of Vatican II call for the establishment of an international police force and a limitation of national police forces or armies in such a way as to deal with domestic problems. So if they are not doing you know, what you say, probably that's the reason why, because they're in favor of internationalism. In fact, a very extraordinary thing happened at the Second Vatican Council when Cardinal Taviani, who was a symbol of Catholic orthodoxy, got up and he gave his speech in defense of the Mass. He was a man who was almost blind. He was at least half blind, and therefore he was not delivering a speech from a text, but he was simply speaking extemporaneously, and he was speaking about a subject that moved him very much, and so he went over time. And they rang the warning bell, and he either didn't hear it or he wanted to finish his remarks, and so they turned the microphone off, and Cardinal Taviani, who was the head of the Holy Office, that's the most important congregation in the Roman Curia, they turned the microphone off on him while he spoke before the bishops assembled at the Vatican Council, which was bad enough, but then the fathers at the Vatican Council broke out into a great applause because this symbol of Catholic orthodoxy was silenced. But later on in the council, for whatever reason, I don't know what it was, if Cardinal Taviani was a broken man or whatever the case might be, Cardinal Taviani got up and he gave a speech in favor of world government. And when he finished that speech, the Council Fathers broke out in uncontrollable applause. Because they understood basically what was the spirit of the reform. And again, to get back to your question, that's probably the reason why. But I think if we look forward to what's coming, if they in fact succeed in their program for this global economy accompanied by a global legislature and a global police force and a global court, and all of those things are already in place. We see them, you know, in the early stages of operation. The question is, what will happen in the practical order? Let's say, for example, if you have a school in you know, some rural community teaching that a person is obliged to be loyal to his own country and not to a foreign power, and that this global government constitutes a foreign power that has deprived us of our national sovereignty, and that Americans should strive and work for the day when they can throw off this oppressive international institution. What will happen then? Will that be a thought crime, or will it be a hate crime?
Yes.
Will the United Nations issue some decree ordering the arrest of that individual? Now, some people might say, well, you know, that's very, very far-fetched. But do you know something? In Quebec, in some areas of Quebec at least, they have issued orders that merchants cannot have signs in English. They have to be in French. And you know who those merchants are appealing to overturn that? To the United Nations. They're appealing to the United Nations to settle a question of what language their signs will be in. And I think that's a foretaste. It portends the fact that this new world order and this new world government will be involved in the lives of American people, telling them what to think, what to believe, who they can associate with, and where their loyalties are.
They're on the record projecting this, incidentally.
We're watching what Catholics believe. Father Jenkins.
You asked earlier, Julius, what was the attitude of the modern church, the Vatican II church, toward the New World Order? Well, there's no question but the spirit of the reform is internationalism, as Father Kelly says. Vatican II did explicitly call for the establishment of a world police force, as he mentioned. But the whole, all of the social movements that are being supported by the modern hierarchy, feminism, the promotion of the idea among women that they're really not fulfilled unless they get out and be leaders of their community. You know, none of this passive, wifely thing about raising a family and being obedient to the husband. That's all passé now in the eyes of the modern hierarchy, evidently. They've even had the nerve in Marialis Cultus under Paul VI to say that Mary was not just some passive person, but she was a leader in her community. So even her person had to be perverted by these people to bring her into line with modern thought. And, you know, in the economic pastorals that have been put out by the hierarchy in this country, the onus of solving all the economic problems of the people is placed in the government. If there is a problem with poverty and so on, whereas formerly it used to be considered to be the charitable work of the churches properly to come to the aid of those who were in distress, now it's all the government. And of course, underlying this idea of turning to government for the solution to all of our problems is socialism. You notice with John Paul II, he has come out against capitalism, he's come out against communism, but he's never condemned socialism. How could he? He has supported socialism in many indirect ways. This is an international order that is being promoted by the Novus Ordo.
Yeah, I think one practical thing which is not hard for people to understand or to grasp would be the question of homosexuality. So homosexuality is an abomination in the sight of God. It is a perversion, it is despicable, it is worthy of the most severe condemnation. Moses ordered the death penalty for it. There is no question whatsoever of the teaching of the New Testament. There's no question whatsoever of the teaching of the Old Testament. Anyone who says that the teaching of the New Testament and the Old Testament can be reconciled to homosexuality is either ignorant or a liar. There's no conceivable way that it can be reconciled. Now, from a Judeo-Christian point of view, it is as absurd to call for homosexual rights as it would be to call, say, for example, for murderers' rights, meaning not that a murderer has rights to be protected by the state, but that he has a right to commit murder, or that gangsters' rights, you know, that if you have chosen the life of a gangster, right, that you should have a right to pursue that particular lifestyle, or whatever the case may be. Let's say bestiality, or the molestation of children. There are even people saying that now. So, in other words, homosexuality is, without any question whatsoever, from the Judeo-Christian point of view, from the natural law, it is an abomination in the sight of Almighty God. What happens if you have an international police force, an international court, an international legislature, and they simply pass laws saying that homosexuality must be accepted as a legitimate lifestyle, and if you do not accept it, you are the aggressor in depriving another individual of his rights? What happens? You get up and you say this is an abomination in the sight of God, worthy of condemnation, and the United Nations, some court in the United Nations, or some official says, you cannot say that. That's a hate crime, the fact that you are condemning this. So you could have a very real situation in which there could be an order coming down from the United Nations, say, for example, to people, to schools, schools that are not affiliated with the government, that are teaching this as an abomination, an order coming down saying to them, if you don't stop teaching that, you're going to have to pay this penalty. And they might even say that you have an obligation to teach that it is permissible because we have determined that it is man's natural right to be perverse.
When you're considering what lies ahead, what we are seeing, partly because of the economics and some other considerations, I think everyone will agree, is a destruction of the traditional family. Not only are women practically not allowed to remain home with their children, I mean, we have this spawned a new industry, the daycare center, but interestingly enough, talking about the brave new world and licentiousness, there was a major study was done, a series of articles in the newspaper, which said that at least 1/3 of all children are born out of wedlock, and I'm sure that number is going to increase. What's going to happen to these people? Where are their families?
You see, what we think is aberration, figures like that, is for much of the rest of the world accepted. It's probably what the figure is in Latin America, or maybe even higher than that in a good bit of Latin America. In the Orient, it would be certainly at least as high and higher than that. When I was a young man, I spent nearly 2 years with the U.S. Air Force in China. And when I came out of China, the war ended, I noticed, went home to New York, that there was a lecture being given by a famous historian, Arnold Toynbee, whose books I had been reading. And so I attended the lecture, and here was this old fuddy-duddy professor preaching that day on how much we had to learn in the West from the East, from the Orient. Well, I had just come from the Orient, see, not just China, but also traveled extensively in India. I knew what the Orient was
From experience.
and is from this personal experience of mine, and I realized that the one lesson that I had to learn from the Orient, or that any of us should have to learn from the Orient, is not to become like the Orient, where human life means nothing, and particularly a woman's life. I mean, women are just slaves in the Orient. Slaves. They sell.
Right.
In China, they sell their daughters into prostitution.
Put to death young
in order
children
to pay,
and babies.
And I'm telling you, this is actually one that I witnessed. To pay for the father's funeral or pay off his debts or whatever. They sell the daughters into slavery. Now, this actually is the kind of society that these one-worlders are giving us. They've already half-orientalized our country, half at least now, with the kind of mental attitudes that I see all around me. And the homosexualism being certainly one of them. Incidentally, that's totally accepted in India. You would see the boys going down the streets. I was so shocked, you know, you can imagine my generation seeing boys walking down the street holding hands or embracing one another openly in Bombay and Calcutta and places like this. But that's what we're doing now in our society. And I'm not talking about, this is a generation ago. All right? So in one generation, we've already descended halfway into hell. Because believe me, India is hell. The girls are in the cages, I'm told, in Bombay, still.
Reverend Fathers, you know, there's a certain signs and movements and which church fathers recognize and will be earmarks of the coming of Antichrist. I'm just wondering how much of these movements of history which have been very imperceptible but now stand out in bold relief and you can almost see it happening before your eyes, how much of it is fulfilling these conditions which will accompany the emergence of Antichrist, especially with this a complete elimination of any concept of morality?
One of the aspects of the preparation of the world for Antichrist, which is brought out by Monsignor Benson in his book, is the worship of the earth. We see that happening today. We see people turning more and more to Gaia, the earth goddess, and worshiping the earth. Man is looked upon as some kind of a sore on the face of the earth. This is a return to paganism. Actually, witchcraft is just an expression of this worship of the earth and natural forces. It's interesting that NAFTA, carries a provision also for instituting a standing police force to enforce environmental concerns related to the NAFTA treaty. So we're going to have an armed police force standing by just to be sent wherever anybody, whoever, thinks it needs to do some shooting.
Or doesn't recycle.
Or doesn't recycle.
Right.
And no one will be safe from this.
Right.
Because it's an international treaty. You know, even our own government, you know, has no right to supersede an international treaty that it's entered into by contract. So this is one of the steps that Monsignor Benson foresaw as approaching the time of the Antichrist.
Father Kelly, what do you see in these broad
I think
movements?
that Mr. Gill's statement was very moving. Your description of what you saw in India and in China, and I think that we perhaps should underline that for the people, that what they're doing is they're bringing us down, they're dragging us down. They are treating the United States of America as if it were on the same footing as these other countries, and that is a lie and a deception. If anything, we should be the model and the example for the rest of the world to pattern itself on.
That's right.
And then I would say, too, I would say from the point of view of the perspective of history and the teaching of the Church and what the fathers of the Church have said, that all of the things are falling into place which would indicate the coming of the Antichrist. You have the emergence of an international government, which is an essential quality of the reign of the Antichrist. You have the general apostasy from the faith, which is absolutely necessary, and which will bring about the coming of the Antichrist. And you have this general dissolution in the worship of the state, almost as if it were God.
You've been watching what Catholics believe.